many companies were, I would say, sold a story that cloud could provide a lot more than it can actually provide.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Stephanie Pell, Senior Editor at Lawfare, with Maia, Hamin, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative, Trey, Herr, Assistant Professor of Cybersecurity and Policy at American University's School of International Service and Director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and Marc Rogers, co-founder and Chief Technology Officer for the AI observability startup Neighborhood.
Allowing folks to compete on security and actually make good security practice a competitive differentiator is something that is a huge carrot to big chunks of the industry that will cost the federal government nothing.
Today, we're talking about cloud security, the Cyber Safety Review Board, or CSRB's report on the summer 2023 Microsoft Exchange online intrusion, and lagging cloud policy. Maia, Trey, and Marc, you published a Lawfare article about cloud security in light of the Cyber Safety Review Board's report on the summer 2023 Microsoft Exchange online intrusion. Before we get into the substance of the report, can you talk about the growth and role that cloud services have come to play in our digital ecosystem over the last 10 years, and why cloud security is so critical?
So cloud computing is really ubiquitous, even if it's not something that we may realize that we're interacting with all the time. A lot of the web services, the software that we use now is enabled in some way or some large part by cloud computing. And then I think especially, relevant to what we talk about in the article, cloud computing is really widely used in enterprise by businesses. So, over 90% by many counts of Fortune 500 companies are using cloud in some way. There's a report that the Atlantic Council published examining the use of cloud computing services in critical infrastructure. And you see how it's really widespread among, these really critical sectors, particularly spaces like healthcare and finance, where you have like a lot of data processing, and the value proposition of being able to outsource your information technology is really appealing. The government is also another big user of cloud computing services. There have been a lot of kind of pushes to transition government agencies to using cloud too. In all these cases, there are going to be questions of, which workloads, which data have you transitioned to the cloud? How critical is that? And as a sidebar, that's something that policy could be doing a better job of trying to measure, manage, and understand. And so all that makes cloud security really critical. If you have a vulnerability in the security architecture of AWS or something like that, that's going to be widespread across a really large number of large companies, large organizations. And I think as we saw in the Microsoft report, or the report on the Microsoft incident last summer, the idea that there could be a cascade of exploitable vulnerabilities in the security architecture at a major cloud provider is maybe not so far-fetched as we'd like it to believe, given how widespread it is.
So there's another thing to consider, and there's two facets to cloud. One is that almost everything you use on the internet is cloud. You may not realize it, but it's going to be in the cloud because the cloud marketed itself as a really easy and quick way for people to build infrastructure. And so a lot of companies saw it as an opportunity to not have to invest on-premise infrastructure, but just move into the cloud and use the resources that were in the cloud to accelerate building these applications. So a lot of small applications suddenly became very big, and suddenly you found almost everything moving that way. And the other aspect is that the cloud was sold as the secure way to do things. Don't invest in your on-premise infrastructure security. Instead, use the cloud because you're going to be using the investment that all of the major cloud vendors have put in order to accelerate your security. And when you look at a cyber shared security model, the fact that you can lean on major vendors like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google and their massive security teams and their security investments is extremely attractive to companies. And many companies were, I would say, sold a story that cloud could provide a lot more than it can actually provide. And so a lot of companies moved the needle of that shared responsibility much more into the cloud. And so they're much more dependent on the cloud's security posture than I think many of them either admit or know. And so when security issues start happening in the cloud, they start to become really serious, because that change in shared security model means many of those companies don't have visibility of how bad the cloud security issues would be to them.
So that's very interesting, because I think a lot of our discussion is going to focus on transparency. But Maia, going back to a comment that you made, so the Cyber Safety Review Board's report details a series of flaws in Microsoft's cloud infrastructure and security processes that led to a hacking group associated with the government of the People's Republic of China, known as Storm 0558, compromising Microsoft's cloud environment last summer. The board noted that within this intrusion, Storm 0588, quote, struck the equivalent of gold. The threat actors accessed the official email accounts of many of the most senior U.S. government officials managing our country's relationship with the People's Republic of China. Can you give our listeners a basic explanation of what is known about how the intrusion happened, Maia or Marc?
The most important thing to note is that this was not a sophisticated hack. While the group, a nation-state group, was a sophisticated group, the vulnerability was one of essentially guessing passwords, a password spraying attack. And so what had happened was infrastructure that had privileged access into the Microsoft email infrastructure had been left up for test purposes. The access hadn't been revoked, and the attackers were able to guess their way into passwords that allowed them into that infrastructure. And then from there, they were able to move into the infrastructure that allowed them to access email. This is not a sophisticated attack. This is like something you'd expect to read about 20 years ago. The report found that it was successful largely because basic security controls weren't in place. Not only did they not decommission this test infrastructure that they'd set up, which, honestly, in any enterprise environment, you set up a highly privileged piece of infrastructure for a test, it's got a very limited scope. The fact that something like that would sit there indefinitely is highly unusual. But it also lacked basic protections like password failure rate detection, attempt detection for people trying to guess things, accessing from unusual environments, all of the simple controls that Microsoft themselves have been pushing to their customers were not in place on their own critical piece of infrastructure. And so that kind of allowed this nation state to get in with something that you'd expect a 16-year-old to be doing.
Was there also an issue with a key that Microsoft still has no idea how the intruders got access to?
In addition to what Marc said, what's known or like what's made clear in the report is that at some point, in some way, the threat actor, Storm 0558, obtained a signing key from 2016. And these signing keys are basically like cryptographic master keys that will let, a system or a user sign for tokens that grant other users access to resources. Now, losing a signing key is already bad, but as Marc described, there were problems that Microsoft had that made this worse and uniquely bad. First, they had no system in place to decommission this key. So there's a process of key rotation whereby you get rid of old keys, you get new keys, and that kind of limits, the likelihood that someone can pick up this key that's 5 years old off the street and just use it to sign for stuff. And so Microsoft had no process for automatically rotating these consumer signing keys. They had stopped manually rotating them. This key should have been gone in 2021, but because they lacked this process, it was still good. And then the other problem was that this was a consumer signing key. So it's something that should be able to sign for, I'm, as just a random individual user, I have a Microsoft account, should be able to sign for, my access to things. But Microsoft had really failed to properly implement the bounds check. So this consumer signing key is able to sign for enterprise accounts, so big business accounts and US government accounts. And so these kind of two failures put together made it possible for this one key that was stolen to be used for much kind of riskier and worse operations. And then there are the compounding failures of, the Microsoft failing to notice the intrusion, having to be notified by their own customer who had found kind of the evidence of this anomalous behavior. So exactly as you asked, Stephanie, it's completely true. Microsoft lost a key. It's far from the only issue, but it's not a great look. And it's especially ominous because they don't really know how it happened. So it's really hard to provide an assurance that it won't happen again.
When you say they don't really know how it happened, in other words, they don't know how Storm 0558 actually acquired the key.
Yeah. And you can see that they're loath to admit this because they actually published a blog post after all this happened with a hypothesis about how this might have happened. At some point, they figured out that this hypothesis probably wasn't true, but they didn't really bother to go back and tell people that hypothesis probably wasn't true. Because it doesn't look great to kind of cop to the fact that you're like, yeah, sorry, we don't really know how that one happened, and we can't promise you that it won't happen again.
It's also worth pointing out that this isn't the first time that these kinds of key thefts have bugged Microsoft in very recent history. The SolarWinds hack was all about keys being stolen from on-premise infrastructure. These golden ticket type thefts. You may remember also there was a Microsoft development environment in which a key was found in a core file that had been a test file, essentially, that had been generated and left lying around and unsecure. And so this is not the first drill they've had with keys being a problem. The fact that they still had no process in place is kind of symptomatic of what was then published in the report.
So maybe to add to this, just two pieces to zoom us out a little bit. I mean, the first thing is, we got some really interesting insight on the nature of the key and its access based on this ProPublica article by Renee Dudley from last week. And one of the things that Dudley's reporting reveals is, in fact, this was a deliberate business choice to allow for this consumer key to be signing across for enterprise environments. It was making life easier for single sign-on for Microsoft customers. And that's one of the really important missing parts from what is otherwise a really good Cyber Safety Review Board report, was the origins of the business case for why this was left in place and for the features associated with this compromise. So that's kind of thing number one, right? We have this key that's able to sign for way more than it should across anybody's reasonable definition of a security boundary, although that term obviously becomes really significant in the Microsoft parlance. But the other point of this, I think, to Marc's point, is there's been a recurring set of conversations about weaknesses in cloud identity infrastructure, just how crucial those are, especially for Microsoft over the last couple of years. And it's concerning that this isn't a space that would have been made a bigger priority for the company a number of years ago. We published a report looking at SolarWinds a couple of years back, and we made some claims at the time that were seen as more controversial about the role that Microsoft's identity infrastructure and those weaknesses played in the overall incident. There was some really good testimony from Brandon Wales. It says at the time, talking through, a third of the incidents don't have any nexus to SolarWinds. It may not be fair that we blame this whole incident or name this whole incident after them. So thinking about this as Sunburst as opposed to SolarWinds. And so I will say it was really exciting to see the amount of attention, and it's really some phenomenal questions laid out in the hearing last week, in part because there is this sort of recurring concern over these identity and access products.
Let me interrupt you. When you say the hearing last week, can you explain what this hearing was?
So House Homeland had Brad Smith, who's Microsoft's president, chief legal officer, and sort of main face of the policy campaign anytime there's a problem in Washington, come down for a little solo chat for about 2.5 hours with the committee on the Storm 0558 incident and the Cyber Safety Review Board's report. And looking at this in historical context, that was really phenomenal. I mean, it's just a tremendous amount of accountability that Microsoft has the opportunity to take over the weaknesses in these products and talk through the sort of changes that they're making in response to the board's report. I will say, too, because I know there's a tremendous number of Hill staff and offices that listen to the podcast, just some absolutely amazing questions, really precise and substantive questions coming from Representatives Menendez, Ramirez, and Magaziner. Representative Magaziner in particular coming back onto the record to clarify a really critical issue, that there was a noted cloud security expert on the board, Heather Atkins at Google, in some ways absolutely built for this investigation, having done foundational work on identity and access management, who recused herself in part because Google is a clear competitor to Microsoft. that there were other board members that took, potentially significant financial penalties in order to remain part of the investigation as part of the DHS due diligence process for the board's members. So that's the hearing last week. Some pointed questions for sure, some confused questions, a lot of, kind of sideways swipes about China and what is China doing, but really just an encouraging thing to see that much attention on this issue, given the trouble that it's been for the U.S. government and for some major customers in the private sector over the last several years.
So I think, as you all have suggested, the board, and certainly in your piece, the board's report offered a chance to peek behind the veil at how companies are securing the opaque, complex cloud infrastructure on which our society increasingly relies. And it makes some recommendations on how to address these problems, with the understanding that these recommendations may take a while to implement. Nevertheless, as I read your piece, I was struck by the fact that, looking at the status quo, you are concerned that current policy is failing to adapt in a way that will push us towards a more secure cloud environment. Can you talk a bit about that, Trey or Marc or Maia?
I think one of the biggest problems is the transparency side of things. It's in the cloud's advantage to push against undue scrutiny. They've got legitimate business concerns about not wanting regulators and other people pushing in on stuff. But the reality is we need that scrutiny and we need that transparency if we want to understand what's going on. If a company's delegating a substantial amount of its security to a cloud provider, then there needs to be a way to understand whether or not that cloud provider is meeting some level of acceptable standard, and for there to be repercussions if they're not. We like to say things like vote with your wallet and buyer beware when we're talking on the consumer side. But how do you apply that in an enterprise to make sure that someone who's putting maybe a multi-million-dollar enterprise application into a cloud environment, banking on the fact that there's supposed to be an encompassing security architecture that's going to embrace the application and make things more secure for them for less investment, that it's really going to deliver on that promise? And I don't think right now any cloud providers have really had their feet held to the fire in that sense. And so we need policy tools that are going to help that kind of scrutiny and move it along. I think when a bunch of us were talking about the national cyber strategy, this was a topic that came up, and talking about how we can improve things like that was something that came up. But it's still very much in its infancy. We need to see some clear development on what are the right tools that we can give policymakers that enable things to look into it, and what are the right ways in which the regulators themselves can get involved and look into it, and how do we then take action on repeated failures? Because this Microsoft failure that we're talking about is not the first. It's not even the 10th. We have seen a long line of failures in cloud platforms, and we keep going, okay, well, we'll learn from that and go around again. And then the same failure happens in just maybe a slightly different way. And it tells you that we haven't really improved things. But because we don't see the changes, we can't measure whether or not things are actually being done to improve.
Yeah, let me jump in with maybe a really specific example of this, because this actually came up in one of Representative Ramirez's questions in the hearing last week. Recommendation, I believe it's 17 in the board's report, asks cloud service providers to transparently disclose vulnerabilities in their services using the CVE process.
Can you say what the CVE process is?
Yeah, sorry. Common vulnerability enumeration. So basically the coding schema for software vulnerabilities, which is its own really interesting separate podcast conversation, because how CVEs get built and filled out is a bit of a fire going on in NIST. But we'll come back to that. Crucially, the board asks for CVEs for these records for vulnerabilities, even those that do not require customer action to patch. So historically, cloud vendors have said, hey, it's opaque, it's our infrastructure, we're operating it. If there's a vulnerability, we'll fix it, but we're not necessarily going to tell you or represent that. So as a customer, you can't see patterns in vulnerabilities that are being found, patched, or the timelines in which those patches happen. And it's concerning when you get vendors that come back and say, you know what, we don't really think that that's something that needs to be patched, or it's not necessarily need to be patched quickly in other contexts. We have no idea inside of these cloud services where these sorts of vulnerabilities might occur, how they get patched, et cetera. And so recommendation 17 says, hey, report them, even if the customer doesn't have to take action. So it moves us forward in a really significant way, because cloud vendors have typically said, hey, if the customer can't do anything, why would we tell you anyway? What would be a transparent and tangible way to implement what Marc and Maia wrote about and talked about in this space, and what we've argued for, is for Microsoft and Google and Amazon to come back and start issuing CVEs for vulnerabilities in their services. And it's something that CISA could ask Microsoft in particular, who has said we're going to implement the entirety of the board's recommendations without quarrel or criticism, could ask them for in just a couple months. The House Homeland Committee, right, could come back and ask Microsoft, where are your CVEs for all cloud vulnerabilities in just a couple of months? So I think that's something that you could see someone come back and say, has this taken place in the next 90 days? And if it hasn't, why not? As a tangible expression of what Marc and Maia is talking about.
I think CVEs are really important, and I think that is like a big part of the story. There's a couple of things I'd bolt onto that, one of which is that the cloud companies have pushed back on the idea of a cloud SBOM or software catalog, and that's something that needs to be understood as well, because when cloud stacks are built on massively complex pieces of software that involve software from all sorts of other sources, and some of those get compromised, the consumers of cloud have absolutely no way of knowing which things could have been compromised in that without something like an SBOM. So there's a concrete thing there. But the piece that's sort of still relatively scary for me is going back to what Trey said about the business decision that Microsoft made. A lot of this is business decisions. So the decision to put that infrastructure out there and have it exposed was a business decision. The decision to connect it into critical infrastructure and the email infrastructure was a business decision. And a lot of these business decisions that we're seeing come around and bite Microsoft, and indeed bite other cloud providers, are business decisions that fly against normal security practice. Normal security practice, if you sent in a regular auditor to look at that environment that was described in this Microsoft incident, they would have had a conniption. Like, this is not how security best practice looks. Somehow we need to have a method of looking at the cloud environment to see where business decisions are made that fly against just basic security best practice, and to make sure that gets tracked, highlighted, and identified in the case of an incident.
Can I jump in with one other specific example? So there's a discussion underway right now about how to reform the federal government's principal security regime for cloud services, FedRAMP. And one of the pieces of this that you could see is if FedRAMP is allowed to delineate its reviews, to separate its reviews of a provider's infrastructure separate from an ongoing contract or service from a review of a particular service. So one of the challenges that FedRAMP has right now is when a customer, federal agency, goes to try and acquire a cloud service, FedRAMP comes in to do its audits, and it works through a series of very circuitous, very paper-driven, very kind of complex audits by external parties, or then checked by other parties, and a series of standards that are kind of rooted in some very old NIST controls that weren't really built for cloud. But that's its process. But it doesn't necessarily have a chance to go through an audit or evaluate the security of infrastructure of a cloud provider outside of one of those contracts. And this is a good example of the kind of place where that would have been really useful, is for FedRAMP to say, hey, we're concerned, Microsoft, or we're concerned, Amazon, about the security of the infrastructure you have. So we're going to come in and we're going to look at that separate from like you selling email or you selling a platform as a service database to a particular federal customer. We're going to disconnect those two things because we really want to get into the guts of the machine and understand what's going on here. A lot of other changes possible and useful, but that's a good example of something that would separate these issues in a little bit more of a useful way.
And there's another way to consider that as well, is a lot of the other security certifications and standards that enterprise companies are used to following, things like PCI DSSS, things like SOC 2 Type 2, are security standards that require an auditor to go in and take a look independently at how things are done. That could be something that the federal government could look at as an extension. I think, ultimately, what we have to have is the visibility and the normalization of good security practice so that companies understand that if you go against the grain and do something that is, has been recommended you don't do for 20 years, that there's going to be some repercussions. But we also need to make sure that the companies are transparent about when things do go wrong. And one of the things that that got highlighted as part of this review is Microsoft has not been very forthcoming in coming forward with talking about what actually happened. What was the real root cause here? What is the impact? If you look at some of Microsoft's incident briefs over the last year, they've actually, I think they should win awards for the way that they spin some of them. If you look at the Lapsus incident, the Lapsus incident involved Microsoft in the sense that Lapsus was able to break in and steal all of Microsoft's source code. But when you read their incident report about it, they literally say, but it doesn't matter because we don't rely on security of that source code for it to be important. Like, these kind of disingenuous incident reports is something that the federal government needs to push back on and stop. Because ultimately, when you're dealing with a situation where there is a degree of opaqueness, every tool that can be used to make sure that the impact and the blast radius of an incident is properly communicated is going to become critical.
So I want to back up for a minute, because one of the things that you talk about in your piece is, frankly, that there are some regulatory frameworks, although obviously they're not getting at the heart of the issues that you all are addressing here today. What is the problem with the regulatory model now? Why is it suboptimal? Why isn't the government able to address some of the problems that we've seen occur, not just with this intrusion, but with others?
This relates very directly to what Trey and Marc were talking about earlier, but I think that this question of how existing compliance frameworks fell short is something that I would have loved to see more fulsomely addressed in this report. And boy, I love the CSRB report. It's shown a lot of light, so no shade there, but obviously the federal government has its frameworks in place. It has FedRAMP for evaluating the cloud services that it uses. Obviously, Microsoft, is a user and of these like large compliance frameworks, and yet there were these really basic failures that, as Marc said, were knowably bad, and surely it feels like they should have been spotted, should have been turned up. And I think that the CISR report says very little about the gaps in these frameworks or in assessments or in auditing that allowed this to happen. I think that's going to be a key question to do better policymaking in the future, is be like, we can all look at this and agree it's bad, and we can see how it failed to be prevented. What are the gaps and the holes that need to be closed in the auditing processes, in the compliance frameworks, in the ways in which government uses those frameworks in order to get better security outcomes. I think that's kind of the million-dollar question, something I would love to see addressed in the report and kind of in follow-up work and digging into this incident and the litany of others that we've kind of seen have similar patterns.
So I've taken organizations through FedRAMP, and FedRAMP is a painful but fairly thorough process to take an organization through. My challenges with FedRAMP are there's no ongoing transparency. So it's kind of one and done. Once you're done with FedRAMP, you have a re-up each year but there isn't the same level of ongoing scrutiny as when you first come in. And the second is that they don't give it teeth. So when companies like Microsoft have failures, there should be some teeth that come in and say, you've done something that contradicts what is laid out in this framework. So now there's going to either be some kind of sanction, or there's going to be a review, and we're going to discuss what the potential penalties will be, and potentially maybe even your FedRAMP certification could be in jeopardy if it's really, 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 really bad. We don't have that. And without without those teeth, I don't think there's any real incentive for organizations to choose security against business ease of use. And I think business ease of use is how you get these business cases that undermine security.
Maybe the one other thing just to add to that is a lot of the certification schemes that exist to date are relatively rudimentary with respect to what it is that they're assessing. It's a lot of technical controls on hardware, software. It's less on operational practices, although you do see that with some of the ISO certifications. It's very little, though, on business process or prioritization. There's no certification for making good decisions. And that's true everywhere. But when we talk about cloud, right, the choice about where you're going to invest time in a highly, like insanely competitive market is a significant driver of the security outcomes of the infrastructure that you operate. And so what we don't see, for example, this is an interesting area of study, but it is potentially a workable area for certification, is any measure of complexity. We see very few measures of input resources to manage that complexity. There's no one that's coming through and auditing how you're spending your security dollars, how many security staff or people are assigned to these different issues, whether security is centralized or not, which was actually, again, something that came up in the hearing last week. Mr. Smith talks about the idea that at Microsoft, there was this challenge of, the cyber people are going to fix it, right? And in fact, we see in the ProPublica reporting, they're really not empowered to override a product team that has a customer need that's been well articulated. And so some of these are things that can be solved with audits and certification, but some of them are also, again, I think they come back to this central point, issues of transparency. If the market's able to understand how some of these CSPs, these cloud service providers, are making these kinds of business choices, they can pick their business tolerance. This might be a company that's going to be at the bleeding edge of functionality, but you will see greater risk as a result of that. So don't put highly sensitive customer data in there, right? Or this is a company that's going to be more conservative, all kinds of trade-offs in that space. But that's just not something that's communicated to the market effectively right now.
So in addition to those issues, one of the things that you all get at in your piece is that maybe to get at those teeth, Marc, that you're looking for, we need a regulatory agency model that actually has power. And you suggest an analogy to another kind of regulatory agency that exists. Can you talk about that?
I think that's the reference to the NTSB and how the airline industry investigates crashes. Like the CSRB was actually started with the idea that would be the NTSB of the internet and the cyber world. But there are profound differences between CSRB and NTSB. NTSB avoids some of these recusement challenges by having a separate pool of experts who look at things, and then a separate pool of people who do some of the reviews and decision making. Whereas the CSRB is just one group, and so that has some challenges. So I'm not sure that the CSRB is something that can be made into something like that in its current form. But I think that level of separation of expertise and the separate pool of decision makers who can make decision makers based on the findings of the experts independently is a good model that could be considered to do it. But I hate to go back to the same topics, but the challenge is transparency. Really, the only reason that the CSRB was able to say what it said about Microsoft is because Microsoft came forward and complied with it. And so we need more tools to make sure that this kind of transparency becomes routine, and that companies are held to account for some of these things. And Trey, to your point about the business processes, I agree, and it's really hard actually to measure these kinds of business processes. And you don't want the government, say, to regulate how businesses should structure themselves or run themselves. But there are technical symptoms that you can see. So the business decision to create a key that allowed access to all sorts of things, that business decision may be difficult to look into and investigate. But the existence of the key and the ability to audit these kinds of things and having policies in place that forbid these kinds of things, those are controllable mechanisms. The ability to make sure that you have tools in place that detect password spraying attacks against your exposed infrastructure, those are things that can be measured and looked at. And so I think that if we start with the technical symptoms and increase transparency and ensure that the right kind of policies are required and are audited on a semi-regular basis, I think we can start to build a foundation that would allow us to ensure that we're picking up some of this stuff that comes through. And that then could lead to empowering a regulatory body to come in and start to take a look at it. Right now, I don't know how a regulator would actually start with some of these companies, because they're just literally going to be going to and knocking on their door and talking to their lawyers to get information about what's going on inside. And that's just going to end up with a discussion between lawyers. We need a way for there to be better transparency. Obviously, that's in a way that doesn't harm competition, that doesn't harm innovation, but that allows an NTSB-like review of an incident when it happens, so that all of the different pieces that led to a failure, catastrophes generally involve multiple failures. The NTSB is an organization that found that out. How do we identify all of the little pieces that led to that catastrophic failure? Right now, I just don't think we have the tools.
I agree completely with everything that Marc said. And to put a really fine point on it too, the NTSB can speak to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and it can say, here are the changes that you need to make. And in fact, in law, the FAA is required to respond to NTSB recommendations. It may not have to implement everything at once, but it has to respond to each of the recommendations and talk about its plan to implement that. There's just absolutely no analog right now with respect to the Cyber Safety Review Board and the agencies that it's able to talk to. And I think that's one of the challenges in this space, is that you need somebody who's going to be able to work closely with the cloud providers with some carrot and some stick in terms of the ability to really make requests of them for access to records and architectural information, and to compel them to make changes to provide transparency. And definitely, I think that CISA, for example, is doing work in this space. I think they're thinking about how to work with cloud providers to implement the recommendations from the report. And they're really well set up in terms of being technically deep. They're smart, things like that. But they do lack that stick. They can't force cloud providers to make changes in response. So I think part of the challenge is thinking about how do you set somebody up to be able to do that better. Somebody who can kind of be like deep and technical like CISA, but have a little bit more of the coercive regulatory power to interface with these providers. I also want to shout one more thing out really quickly, which is that with respect to transparency, I think there are other regulators who can play interesting roles in this space. And it's not a panacea, but the US Department of Treasury released a really great report on the use of cloud services in the financial sector. And that went a long way towards, they asked their members to understand how they're using these services, what barriers they face, things like that. So I think that there are ways that regulators of cloud customers can use some of their power to kind of try to drive forward transparency in their sector and to round up some of the concerns and considerations so the whole federal policymaking apparatus is better equipped.
So there's one challenge on that first piece, and that's the FAA is a much more operationally oriented agency than anything we have for the internet. CISA is a technical organization that is able to provide a lot of support, but they don't have the operational engagement with a lot of these organizations yet. That lack of sort of the operational side of it, I think, is going to be one of the biggest challenges we have going forward with the internet side of things. We need potentially an agency that has an operational relationship and an deep operational understanding, as well as a deep technical understanding. And that's when you start to understand the roots of some of these problems and the slippery slopes that sometimes these companies can find themselves on, and when brakes need to be put in place.
So Maia, you talked about how to bring companies to the table, if you will, cloud service providers, and you use the terminology, the carrot and the stick. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I can. And there's a lot of million-dollar questions here, to be clear. But I think we talk about the carrot in the article in part out of a recognition that, the burden of complying with like many different regulatory frameworks, helping your customers meet, their obligations under HIPAA or under payment card industry standards, or under data privacy standards. Like it's not trivial to comply with all of these things. And so I think that I won't say that harmonization is a dirty word, but there's always a question about harmonization. But I think in this case, there's some merit to thinking about, to the extent that we can encourage policy to focus in on a set of really core and key requirements, and then use those as kind of the primary basis for cloud provider security. That creates maybe more of an incentive for cloud providers to come to the table in terms of shaping, what these look like in, as Marc Rogers described, like avoiding the problem of everything being a lawyers to lawyers issue, and instead trying to get like lots of technical experts in the room to think and talk about how do you set these up in like a really engineering first kind of way. I think FedRAMP plays a really interesting role here, and FedRAMP being the government's certification process for the cloud services that it uses. FedRAMP is a place where the government kind of already has some mechanism in place to ask for and request transparency. And I think it could be a really interesting place to road test some of the thinking on what should these requirements look like, what should we ask of folks, with then the possibility to, where appropriate, consider how those practices can be extended to, kind of like the broader market. But the federal government has its own kind of proving ground in FedRAMP, and I think there's some great recommendations in the Cyber Safety Review Board report, as well as just some exciting opportunities with FedRAMP having been, semi-recently codified into law, the restructuring of its board, some opportunity, I think, to, experiment with that as not the stick, but the requirement, and unite that kind of with like a desire to bring cloud providers to the table in other ways in response to this report to move things forward.
There is another bigger stick that the government could use. And that's that the government is in control of some very, very powerful procurement levers. And those procurement levers have the ability to change the industry. It's the question is whether or not the government's ready to start using some of them. There's challenges because of, for example, the Microsoft monoculture makes it very hard to use procurement levers against Microsoft. But, there has been talk about moving away and freeing up some of this so that we can use some of those powers. And I think that's really important. And I do want to shout out to OECD, who have actually been talking about the harmonization side of things. We're in a position now where every single state is going to have its own privacy rules. And it's not just a challenge to follow them all. It's potentially going to be impossible to follow them all. And as we started to create this massively fragmented environment, we're actually hurting ourselves. We're making the US a less attractive environment for international organizations to do business in. So harmonization is in all of our interests to get done.
So just two other thoughts on that. I think one, procurement is a huge federal power. It's a non-trivial consumer of cloud services, the idea of procurement reform is a really popular talking point by one of Microsoft's competitors in the space, and it's not unwarranted for that. But I would just say two things here. One, federal government has struggled mightily to drive change in practice and organizational policy through procurement reform, and looking at sole source and fixed price contracting in the DoD space is a case study in that. Space launch is one of the most recent, right? You see the side-by-side of Boeing and SpaceX and this notion of contracting process driving really crappy outcomes, right? It's a known issue inside of DoD, but it's something that's, for decades, it's been a struggle to reform. So I don't necessarily see that cyber is going to be the test bed for doing that well, but it does have to be part of the conversation. The other piece to this, though, and this is something where the government, not as regulator, but as the entity that's responsible for setting kind of fair, open, and responsible markets, has a really interesting opportunity, which is we need to drive greater skepticism of cloud security. Right? Part of the challenge we're dealing with is the assumption that a lot of people had, as Marc laid out in the beginning, of like, oh, it's the cloud, it's fine. It's going to be safer, it's going to be better. In fact, flipping that, allowing folks to compete on security and actually make good security practice a competitive differentiator is something that is a huge carrot to big chunks of the industry that will cost the federal government nothing. But rather than sort of taking this, it's fine, we can get their cloud is going to be okay approach, there is an opportunity for USG, I think, especially the regulators that we've been talking about, but also the White House to take a role here. And so I'll maybe one last thought on this. I've actually been a little underwhelmed by the Office of the National Cyber Director's activity in this space. And we love the team there. They're doing a lot of great work. But the White House has been incredibly absent. And that's ONCD, it's the Chief of Staff's office, it's the NSC, on cloud security in ways that could have helped address some of the systemic issues we're seeing drive part of the surge in ransomware in the last 3 years. That would have helped address potentially this specific set of identity and access management challenges that Microsoft has been grappling with also for several years. These are political battles. And it was a little bit disappointing, to be totally honest, to see Secretary Mayorkas come out and declare victory the day after Microsoft issued this Secure for the Future initiative proposal. Like, we need to see the U.S. government, led by the White House, led by political leadership, take a slightly more skeptical approach to how these companies are taking on these issues. And I think it would help both them, but also the market as a whole. So there's opportunities to be played here in terms of how cloud stitches across cybersecurity and the U.S. strategy and policy toward that. But I think as Marc and Maia have both hit on, there's a lot of room for growth still.
So, Trey, you hit upon Microsoft's response to all of this. They made public response in writing. And then, of course, as we've discussed, Brad Smith testified last week on the Hill. So can you describe, first of all, what has Microsoft's response been, and what are your thoughts on it?
Sure. So Microsoft has come out and said, we're going to announce a series of initiatives. We're going to try to drive a security-first approach across a number of different areas of our engineering and security activity. We're going to make security part of the financial incentive for, I think, the 17 top leaders in the company. Part of their annual bonus will be based on security metrics. And we're going to try to drive a security over features culture. That's a quote from the CEO, Satya Nadella. Now, full disclosure on this, I worked for Microsoft for 2 years. There are some tremendous people that work inside the organization, and there are some security and engineering talent that has struggled to work uphill against, at times, a broader company culture, which the Cyber Safety Review Board put a really nice handle on. But on the whole, it's a company that has the capacity to do really incredible things in this space. I think we are in sort of trust but verify mode, though. Microsoft's president made this comment about, the DC effect of dropping an investigative article the morning of a hearing, so it's all everybody talks about, and nobody has a chance to respond because it's sort of lost out of the news cycle a week later. There's another common DC tactic, which Microsoft has employed a lot, which is to come out and make vague commitments and very broadly publicized pronouncements and then never follow through on them. Providing low cost or no cost access to logging and not making logging a paid for add-on was a really big part of the conversation after SolarWinds. It's taken years. It's still only kind of happening in maybe like a pilot deployment way. It's not really clear, and it's not very obvious how it's benefited the federal government as a consumer. So we'll have to see. The specifics for how security are made part of the financial the compensation for individual employees is important. It really does need to reach that M2 or M1, that lower level manager, especially in the security engineering space, not just the C-suite. Understanding what the actual indicators of performance on driving security over features look like. There are some specified in Microsoft's SFI, the Secure Future Plan. There are some that are pretty open and vague. So there's a lot, I think, still left. And it would be great if maybe a year later we came back and we had Microsoft, Google, and Amazon at a hearing and said, hey, this is Microsoft's laid out indicators. How's everybody doing on these metrics? And let's talk about the comparative performance of these three incredibly important players, not just in the industry, but I think, again, to the point we started with this conversation, for everybody that uses digital systems.
So I think there's something big that needs to change before I'll be anything other than skeptical. And that is Microsoft needs to move its posture away from being brand defensive to being security posture defensive. If you look at the way things roll out in terms of the messaging they put out whenever there's an incident, if you look at the commentary from people who are in or have been in Microsoft, look at the recent ProPublica article where several former well-known Microsoft people were quoted. There is a systemic problem inside Microsoft. Security problems are routinely identified. They have some of the best security engineers in the world working for them. But when they find issues, those issues are brought up the chain and are then either put to one side, deprioritized, or outright hidden because of the potential brand impact of having them come out. And that's got to change. they have to embrace the idea that security issues are things that need to see sunlight, that you need to work on these things. You need to make people aware that you're working on these things. And in that sense, hold yourself accountable and allow yourself to be held accountable. But right now, I don't think that they've changed that internal structure to fit that. When SolarWinds happened, there was a compartmentalization of people working on the incident so that different parts of their own organization couldn't hear what was being done by different security people in that space. I don't believe that has changed. And that's because the brand optics, the PR, is much more important. And so they want to contain the narrative and make sure that the right story goes out. That's all got to be dismantled. And that's going to take a lot longer than just some commitments, I think.
Maia, any additional thoughts?
I agree profoundly with what Trey and Marc have said. I think you hear skepticism as kind of a recurring theme and word in some of these responses. And I think that's correct. I think when you listen to Brad Smith's responses, he's very eager to focus on these future commitments, on the steps that Microsoft intends to take. And he is much less willing to, I think, delve into the real whys behind some of the problems that the Cyber Safety Review Board reveals. So the questions of how were these decisions made? What was wrong with Microsoft's culture that it failed to prioritize these things? Any question about the business decisions or business processes that kind of Trey and Marc have already raised? I think it's likely that that does come from a position of brand protection, as Marc raises. But I think, we collectively, civil society, policymakers in particular, have to get more comfortable calling Microsoft and any other tech company that does similar things out on these things. And instead of saying, it's important to know what they're going to do for the future, but it's easy to make promises about the future to kind of like glide over what has happened in the past and how you intend to avoid kind of repeating those mistakes. And I think even processes like the rollout of the recall feature, which everyone is immediately like, this is a horrible security nightmare. Like, what are you doing? And they eventually, recalled recall. This kind of indicates that you can't create a culture where people just keep making the same decisions. And then when they're called out about it, they're like, oh, we're so sorry. How could this have happened? I'm sure we will do differently in the future. There needs to be, I think, as folks have said, holding companies to the commitments that they make. But I think also really thinking about, as we've talked about, like, what would it take for the US government to, vote with their wallet with respect to these issues? Are we in a position where the US government is capable of becoming non-dependent on Microsoft product and services? If not, what would it take to get to that position? And I think ensuring that the US government and the large businesses don't feel themselves beholden through technical lock-in, through, the sheer size of these vendors to any particular vendor, kind of like negatively impacting their ability to move away from these vendors on the basis of repeated security failures. I think that's going to be another core component of making accountability really stick.
So I think recall is an interesting canary here, because they didn't recall. They pulled recall back in the face of severe criticism and in the face of a security tool that allowed bad things to be done with recall. But very shortly afterwards, they then pushed recall back out on a quote unquote voluntary basis, and along with the narrative that it's completely fine. That's not a response to a security problem. That's a response to a brand problem. And so that tells me that nothing's changed yet.
So that, I think that drives home a really good point maybe to close on, which is we know most of this, and we can talk about most of this because of some really good work from the Cyber Safety Review Board. And so I will just say, like, I'm encouraged by the improvement in focus and depth over their first two reports. And I think this is moving the board much closer to what the sort of ideal or envisioned goal for their kind of products could be. There's a lot of room for improvement for sure. It's a young organization. We make these comparisons to the National Transportation Safety Board, but it's had decades, right, to mature over time. So I think as we look at this, the opportunity that the board had here executed well within their existing remit is good. Hopefully they will continue on this trend of open and informative studies that are not reliant on classified information and highly classified appendices, that continue to expand the roster of members that are on the board, that are able to be involved in these processes, that they take on politically tricky issues, big companies, and complex failures like this. But I will say one thing that we've shared as feedback to the board, and I think are really excited to see in the next investigation and others that they do, and Marc and Maia hit on it, is why, not just what happened, is incredibly important to these sorts of stories. And recall is indicative of something that a number of folks have observed, myself and others, about Microsoft and other large companies like this, which is it's not one place. It doesn't have one mind. And often an organization inside of the company have no idea what other parts of the company are doing or thinking. And so understanding more about that background business process, that engineering story, and that product story will help us avoid these kinds of issues in the future and will provide better guidance and recommendations to other companies. But the board and others have to be able to dig into that why, that backstory, not just the what happened inside of a single incident. So tools like the board, as it's changing the SEC's incident notification requirements, which have been a tremendous asset to the security community and unalloyed good. These are really important tools for SIA as it starts to evolve, right? I think we're going to see more from in time, but they need to continue to evolve as well. It's not just the private sector that we hope for improvement from. And so I think, well, this was really good. No question. There's still some room for improvement, and I think there's still opportunity for that to have a big impact on this space.
We'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you all so much for joining me.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
It was a pleasure.
Really appreciate the investment from everybody.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Patja, and your audio engineer this episode was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.